Gary, first of all, thank you so much for making the time. Welcome to Lamestream. As a independent startup ourselves, it's great to have someone on who's started their own platform, getting their message out independently. I just thought maybe to begin with, I could get you to tell me a bit about how you first got into doing analysis and independent content online and your journey into this.
Yeah, it's a long story. My background, basically, I was a trader for a long time. I worked as an interest rates trader for Citibank here in London. And I got into that just because I was a poor kid growing up in East London, and I was good at maths and I wanted to make money, just like pretty much everyone. I went to London School of Economics, which is a very fancy economics university here in London, and I won a card game competition called the Trading Game, which Citibank used to run before the financial crisis, and I got a job as an interest rates trader. But long story short, I worked in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, and I saw financial markets and economists repeatedly predicting an economic recovery that didn't happen. So I became kind of obsessed with understanding why is our economy so weak, why are our economic recoveries so weak, why do living standards keep falling. And I did loads of things. I worked for some think tanks, I went back to university, I did a master's at Oxford. But when COVID started, I could see inequality was going to get way worse. So I decided to sort of go public on it. I started writing for newspapers, and I started up the YouTube. Started that in 2020. And I wrote the book. The book came out beginning of last year, 2024. The book's gone absolutely mental out here, and that's really blown the YouTube up. And yeah, it's huge now. I'm sort of one of the biggest voices in the UK and in Europe, trying to just explain to you what's happening on the economy, explain why it's going to get worse, crucially why it's linked to inequality, and ideally how we can stop it, how we can stop things getting worse.
Something here in Australia we've been fascinated with about the UK very recently is that we recently had the biggest far-right rallies that we've ever seen in this country. There were marches in every major city, and the far-right party here, One Nation, has reached its highest ever polling. It's gotten to 12%, and that's made us very interested in what is going on in the UK, which right now seems a little bit further down that path, and the far-right has risen in popularity massively. To begin with on that, what has happened in Britain, do you think, to create the conditions where those ideas are gaining so much traction with people?
Yeah, so I've been saying for years that what would happen is the Conservatives, our centre-right party, would lose. Labour would come in with a massive majority. They'd fail massively, and we'd get a far-right government after that. And really, my feeling on that is, do you ever remember, I think somebody told me he was Australian, actually. Do you remember this? There was this ice skating race in the Winter Olympics. And there was this Australian guy.
I know exactly
who
what
was
you're talking about.
Like half a lap behind everyone, right? Because there's no ice in Australia, I guess. And then just before they finished, one guy was over, takes out all the other guys, and this Australian guy comes through and finally wins. For me, really, this is the story of the far right, because we have this problem of growing inequality, and I'm convinced this is what is causing the living standards to fall. And nobody's really doing anything about it, right? Neither the centre-right parties or even the centre-left parties, who you might think should be doing something about it. So what I see when I look at the economy is basically, you've got an economy that has a cancer, but all of the economists and the main political parties are treating it like a seasonal cold. And they just think if you just be a little bit more sensible, try and do a little bit more investment, just work a little bit harder, we'll come out of it. And you have this growing and growing and growing problem of growing wealth inequality, which is accelerating, right? Because that's what compound interest does, it accelerates. And nobody's dealing with it. So what that means is every single time a new government comes in, they try to sort of sensible their way out of this growing inequality crisis. They don't do anything about the inequality. The economy worsens, living standards fall. And what you're getting, this is not just in Australia, it's not just in the UK, it's all over the world. You get this growing dissatisfaction with the mainstream, traditional, historic centre-left and centre-right parties, because regardless of who is in power, living standards just fall. And I think when that happens, it creates this growing sense that we need something radically different. So then people are looking around and saying, well, what are the new ideas? And I think it is really, really obvious in pretty much every country in the Western world what the loudest new idea is, and that is this far right. So I think what you're getting is the far right are winning elections. They've won in America, they've won in Italy, they've won in Poland. They will win here. I think they will win in Germany eventually. They'll win across the world. They're winning just because, in the same way that this guy won the ice skating race, right? Which is, you have these traditional parties that have consistently, obviously, visibly failed to improve living standards for 20 years now. And these guys are winning just because they are the only other horse in the race, And that's a big part of the reason why I do what I do, is I'm trying to say, listen, there is another alternative. You deal with this by addressing inequality, address an unfair tax system. But you look through history, at times of serious, prolonged economic weakness, the far right has always done well. The far right has always done well. And it's just the obvious, people are desperate for something new. And at the moment, the far right are the only loud and well-funded alternative political voice on the table.
Well, I can definitely assure you that ice skating metaphor, the guy's name was Stephen Bradbury, and doing a Bradbury is like absolutely understood all across Australia. So I can promise that goes well. Our friends here in the mainstream kind of media sometimes look at what's going on in the UK. You mentioned Italy, the US, these places, and they say it would be impossible for that to happen here. Voters in Australia are very risk averse. We've only ever had two major parties. We've got a different electoral system. But you mentioned, you've probably heard that all before, because you were warning about this when Rishi Sunak was still Prime Minister, when the Conservatives were still in government. You were saying reform would rise, and would rise after a Labor government was elected. So, what are your sort of, I guess, like warnings, or as someone who predicted it that far out, things that I guess Australians can look out for, or sort of complacencies they shouldn't let develop?
Well, the first things to say are, like, those exact points that you made were exactly true here in the UK as well, and everybody made them. I mean, the UK has a great reputation for being a very sort of traditional conservative country. And we also have this political system, which is first past the post, which makes it very difficult for new parties, for small parties, for extremist parties or far-right parties to grow. Those things are all true here, and they're favourites to win the next election here in the UK. I think one thing that I would like to warn people of in Australia is a big thing that I see here, and it frustrates me a lot, right? So I come from a pretty poor background in East London. We're a very working class upbringing. Then I've been to fancy unis and I've worked a fancy job, and now I exist in this sort of politics, media space. And as you can imagine, now I often socialise with a lot of people who are from much more middle class backgrounds. I went on a very well known politics podcast here in the UK called The Rest is Politics. You know that? And the guys who present it are, well, actually, one of them is from a sort of more working class background. One of them is from a more sort of almost aristocratic background. And he said this thing to me, which I get very often said to me, which is, what do you mean things are getting worse? Like, things are okay, aren't they? The economy is getting better. And there was this really vibed with, did you ever hear this phrase that was going around quite a lot in the US during the late Biden administration? The vibes are off. Did you hear that phrase? The vibes are off.
Yeah.
And the vibes are off was a phrase to refer to the economic phenomenon that most economists thought, looking at the data, the economy was getting better. And yet the public was increasingly angrier and angrier and angrier, and insistent that things weren't getting better. And then, of course, they then voted out the Democrats and voted Trump in for a second term. When you have growing inequality, one of the big consequences of that is that your society kind of divides into two groups. And I really see that here, which is one group which has, elite university educations and has access to these sort of fancy jobs, and they move around in these sort of fancy circles, and they become incredibly divorced from what life is like for people who maybe didn't go to these fancy universities and don't have access to these fancy jobs. So what you end up with is this ridiculous debate entirely peopled with people from richer backgrounds. All of them are getting richer. They don't have any contact with regular people. They're convinced the economy is getting better, while in this country, 50% of people in this country struggle to feed their kids and turn the heating on. I'll give you another good example. I went on LBC, which is one of the most popular radio shows, just last week, okay? And they were saying the whole thing, it's going to be fine. We're going to build more houses and it's going to fix the housing crisis. And I said to him, can you name me one city in the world that has built its way out of this housing crisis? One single city. And he turned around to me and said, oh, there are other places in the world where housing is more affordable. And I said to him, where? Can you guess where he said? Australia. He said Australia. And I was like, this is the thing. And this is what I want you to be wary of, right? I want you to be wary of this very stupid, optimistic, let them eat cakeism of the elite class that becomes divorced from and separated from what life is like for your average man or woman on the street. That is the big thing which I really, really, really want to be wary of, because I know Australia likes to think of itself as this place where, there's no class system and we're all on the same level. But the truth is, inequality is increasing massively in Australia. So what I would really advise you, have that visibility as best as you can, understand what's happening on street level. Don't just look at the economic statistics, because when the economic statistics don't cover distribution, they can be very misleading. You can have this top 5% that's doing fantastically, while the bottom 60% is collapsing. And it is that kind of division which will destroy your society, which will drive the far right and destroy that economy. That's what I'd like to make you wary of.
On part of what you're talking about, the sort of both those different bubbles existing, the people that tend to occupy media and stuff, a lot of people in sort of traditional legacy media will kind of say that a big part of the rise of the far right, but in the UK or in the US with Trump, is sort of social media, the internet, online disinformation, that plays a big role. You're somebody who has flourished online. We are people who have started our own platform online. How much of a truth is there to that? Does the traditional media have their own questions to answer for when it comes to the rise of some of these ideas? How seriously should we take that idea of kind of social media, new media being a cause of this versus traditional media's kind of role in it?
There is absolutely no doubt that the rise of the global far right is to a big part attributable to the fact that the far right has done a much better job than anybody else of occupying and getting ahead of this shift in the way political media works, right? There's obviously been a big shift in how people consume political media, massive shift. And the far right has just done a way better job than anyone, especially the US far right. But even here, Nigel Farage, the leader of Reform, has more TikTok followers than the other 649 UK MPs combined. That is the situation, right? But okay, so yes, 100% that's part of it. But I think the more interesting question is, why has that happened? So I went sort of public. I went out into the media in 2020. And the first thing I did is, I guess, what most people would do, which was I wrote an article and that got published on a website called Open Democracy, and then that got picked up by The Guardian, and then I wrote for The Guardian. I was writing for The Guardian, and but then this was early COVID, and I was making these predictions. There's going to be a cost of living crisis, an inflation crisis, and my friends were worried, right? And then when I got talking to my friends, I realized they were getting worried, and they were going straight to YouTube. Straight to YouTube is where they were going, and it was obvious back in 2020 that is where the tide was shifting, to YouTube, to online. And then I immediately started up a YouTube channel, right? And now we've got 1.5 million subscribers. But we film it here in my kitchen, you know what I mean? This is just me in my kitchen, and we get more views than Question Time, which is the biggest UK politics show in the country, right? That's happened because almost none of the traditional political and media players in this country moved online and tried to occupy the social media space, except for the new right, the far right. That's insane. That's crazy. It's why did the centre and the left make no attempt to occupy the new media politics space, even though years ago it was obvious that all of the power was going to shift there? I think it's honestly amazing, and it's fascinating. And even now, we've got a Labour Party that's dying on its arse out there here in the UK. They're desperately unpopular. Prime Minister is desperately unpopular. They have no online social media presence, right? And I've built this massive social media presence, and I've turned up to them, right, and said, we are bigger than any far right channel right here, right? And then I say to them, okay, are we going to work together? They're not even interested. It's unbelievable. It's almost like your enemies are developing a nuclear bomb, and you're just like, well, it's fine. We were just planning to lose anyway. And then some random kid from East London turns up and was like, okay, you don't have to lose. I've made the nuclear bomb for you. And you're like, no, we really, really want to lose. And I think this, but again, it comes back to this phenomenal disconnectedness. I think it is true. We have this, and maybe I'm speaking a little bit from my class position here in the UK, but we have this sort of fancy upper middle class that has their fancy jobs that is so disconnected. They made I honestly think they don't even really care about losing. If there is nobody, they're so busy writing their fancy articles and I guess getting their kitchen renovations that they made no attempt to occupy the obvious, most important media, political, strategic space which is online. And I think, we need to ask ourselves, any of us who don't want our countries to fall to the far right, we need to look at our political parties and our media institutions on the left and on the centre and ask them, why did you make no attempt to win? It is, honestly, it's like the harakiri. It is a suicide of the Western left and centre. They're just giving it to the right. It's totally insane. It's totally insane. And I've been making calls out on my channel to people in this country, and I did a tour of Europe earlier this year. If you don't want the far right to win, get out there, make videos, get a YouTube, get a TikTok, get an Instagram, get a Facebook, whatever. Make videos, get them online, because the space is there. There are lots of people that don't want to vote for the far right, but the problem is there is not really anybody trying to occupy the online space. You need to be where people are, and people are online.
And your platform, Gary's Economics, you break a lot of this stuff down for people, and you know that in Australia, house prices, as they are all over the world, is a massive, massive issue. But there is a certain flavour to the obsession here in Australia, I think, and how we talk about home ownership. I just thought it'd be interesting, as someone who breaks down inequality, talks about asset prices, to maybe just talk to you a bit about some of the crazy stats that are around about house prices in this country and just get your genuine reaction to them. I looked up that in the UK since 2000, I believe house prices have gone up by over 250%. Here in Australia, Gary, since 2000, the average house price has gone up by 493.5%. I mean, what just is a reaction to that amount of increase in asset prices?
It's huge. I think rising house prices are a really interesting thing, because it's really interesting to ask yourself the question of who's winning and who's losing there. Because I think there's this problematic thing about rising house prices, which is people see the house price going up and they think, oh, I'm going to be rich now. It's fantastic. And they can envisage, when I get old, I'm going to sell that house and I'm going to have a great retirement. I'm going to be super rich. And they don't ask themselves, well, how does my kid get a house then? Because the older generation of Australians probably think they're cashing in on that. If you use that increased house price to have your lovely meal now in retirement and have your great retirement, you sell it, you spend it, you are giving away your kids' inheritance. Your kids will have nowhere to live. And when house prices go up, I think that's one of the big reasons that you start to see, and it's massive here, and I would imagine you're seeing it there in Australia as well, you see this division in voting preferences by age. And that is because the rising house price, the old see it as a win, but younger people recognize we're losing our homes. We are losing our homes. That rising house price, what I see there, that rising house price is the mechanism by which the rich take the housing of the poor. That is what it is. The reason the house prices are going up because the rich get richer and richer and richer and richer, and they can pay more. And as soon as you tap out, that's it. Your house, your family will never own property again. Your family will never own property again. So I would like older Australians and home-owning Australians to really think about what it means to the future of their family, to the future of their country, if housing becomes an asset which is unaffordable to working people. What does that mean for the future of your family and the future of your country? Because too many people in countries that are going to be destroyed by rising house prices are looking at the rising house prices and thinking it's a good thing.
And just a final question, we probably similar age, and it's been I feel like a lot of people have grown up in an era where there has been just like this intransigent, inability to grapple with this growing inequality up until now. You have had some luck in the UK with forcing things like wealth taxes onto the agenda, to getting a lot of mainstream coverage and debate of those issues. Like, what hope do you see for forcing some of this into the agenda, for trying to get some kind of like positive addressment of inequality in countries like the UK and Australia?
Yeah, so my background is I'm a trader, and my job was to make predictions and to make good predictions. And I've got a very, very, very good track record of making a lot of very good predictions. That's why I'm a multimillionaire. You can look at my first YouTube video. I'm very, very good at making predictions. I guarantee you there will be big political change in the next 10, 15, 20 years here in the UK and out there in Australia. I absolutely guarantee you, because living standards, which are falling quite quickly now, you're starting from a high level in Australia, but they are still falling for your average people. They will keep falling. They will keep falling in an accelerating fashion, and people will demand change. People will absolutely demand change. So I guarantee you that change will come. I guarantee you that change will come. And that's the only reason that somebody like me making YouTube videos in his kitchen, with no funding, can get 50 million views a month, because people want political change. People will get political change. I absolutely guarantee it. People will get political change. The future is going to change, because inequality is changing. The economy is changing. The future is there to be won. It will be decided now. The problem is, we can all see at the moment who's winning that debate, not just here in the UK, but across the world. It is the far right. So, I go and tell Australians, British people, Europeans, what kind of future do you want? Because the status quo is not going to stay the same. Either the far right is going to take over, or we're going to do something about inequality. So if what you want is to avoid a far right takeover of your country, you need to be understanding this message, building an alternative future, which is saying we can make the economy better by addressing inequality, by fixing a broken tax system, which currently taxes working people far more than billionaires. There is an alternative future. So what gives me hope is the knowledge that we will definitely get change. And as the far right grows and grows and grows, I do hope that will precipitate a little bit more serious action from those players, like our Labour Party here, like your Labour Party there, that have been sitting on this boring let's change nothing philosophy, which is never going to fix it, and push them to doing something more serious, taking more action. Every day that goes by is a day it becomes more obvious where we're going. Listen, all it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing, So I think more and more people need to stand up and make a decision about whether they're going to be involved in deciding the futures of their countries, because the fight is here, happening today.
Gary, thank you so much for your time. As I say, I've followed you for a long time, and yeah, you are going to be on our shores very soon. You're touring Australia and New Zealand in February and March. People can get tickets through thinkable.events to come out and see you, and very much hope to run into you while you're here or come along to an event. Hopefully we haven't quite fallen to the far right by the time you visit, Gary.
Thanks for having me.